Fairies are well-known mythical creatures that are spread across many cultures throughout human history. Some early origins describe fairies as angel-like, while others describe a more demonic creature, depending on which part of the world you asked. Because most modern people typically think of Tinker Bell when picturing a fairy, it's hard to imagine that the legend of such innocent-seeming creatures have been involved in one of the most infamous murder cases in Ireland's history. The murder of Bridget Cleary, the woman who was taken by fairies. Born Bridget Boland in Ballyvadlia, County Tipperary, Ireland, in about 1869 to Bridget and Patrick Boland, Bridget grew up living the typical life of a laborer's daughter. She attended the convent school in Drangan, where she was described by her peers as exceptionally bright and sociable. She later worked as a dressmaker's apprentice when she met and married a cooper named Michael Cleary in August of 1887 when she was around 18 years old. Bridget then began working as a successful dressmaker and also raised chickens and sold the eggs, while her husband continued his work as a cooper, a well-paid craft of making wooden casks and barrels. In early March of 1895, 26-year-old Bridget Cleary made a trip to the local town of Kyle na Grana to sell eggs, and upon her return, she began displaying symptoms of a respiratory illness. This was peculiar to her husband Michael, as Kyle na Grana at the time was a place of some unsavory characters and was known locally to be the site of a fairy ring. It is said that as Bridget became more ill, she began acting more strangely, likely due to fever, but her husband grew weary and sought the advice of Dennis Gainey, an herbalist and fairy legend believer who may have suggested that his wife was not ill, but was taken by fairies and replaced by an exact replica called a changeling. You see, during the late 1800s, the fairy superstitions in Ireland were dying, but there were still many people who believed in the inhuman creatures. In local Irish legend, fairies, sometimes referred to as the good people, would prey on the weak, usually young women and children, and would steal the victim and take them to the fairy world. The victim was then replaced with a sickly changeling who looked and sounded exactly like the victim, but would act slightly different. It is said that the only way to retrieve a loved one who is taken by the fairies is to torture the changeling, usually by fire, or kill it, and the loved one is returned shortly after. Most victims of fairy hysteria were children with disabilities, such as 4-year-old Michael Leahy, who was accused of being a fairy in 1825 because he could not walk or talk, and was drowned during a ritual to try to rid the changeling said to have taken his body. There are several more documented instances where children were killed under similar circumstances in Ireland, but the fairy legend was also used as an oppression tool for women and children who acted unacceptably, and was often an excuse for husbands to beat their wives if they displayed behaviors that were unpreferable, citing that only a fairy would act that way. Bridget herself was described as an independent and pagan-like woman, implying that she was not exactly the type of woman that lived up to society's standards on how a person of her gender should act. Bridget's symptoms worsened in the days that followed and was visited by many family and neighbors who got word of her illness and potential fairy affliction. A local doctor was called to the home and she was diagnosed with nervous excitement and slight bronchitis, though Michael was allegedly unconvinced and believed the sickly woman in his bed was not his wife. Events escalated and came to a climax on March 14th when Bridget was held down by a few of her male cousins and Michael attempted to force a tincture of boiled herbs into her mouth, a fairy treatment recommended by Gainey. When she protested, Michael grew more angry and dumped urine from her chamber pot onto her body. Michael began a gruesome interrogation of Bridget in the presence of several of her family and neighbors, demanding she say whether or not she was his wife, Bridget. At one point, Bridget allegedly retaliated by telling her husband, "Your mother used to go with the fairies, and that is why you think I'm going with them," in a sharp-tongued manner. Infuriated, Michael eventually dragged her from her bed to the kitchen fire and held her to the smoldering wood, demanding in the name of God that the changeling reveal itself. Michael then stripped her clothing, doused her in lamp oil, and set her on fire in front of a handful of witnesses who just stood by, most of whom were Bridget's own family and included her own father. Some newspapers reported that directly following Bridget's death, neighboring men stood by with black-handled knives, a weapon believed to be potent to evil spirits, and sat up all night believing that the real Bridget would ride in on a horse. Once she arrived, her bounds would be cut with the knife and she would be set free and restored, as some legends suggest. This, of course, never happened. The next day, on March 15th, Bridget was reported missing and a police investigation was launched. A tornado of rumors spiraled locally, and some believed Bridget really was taken by fairies. Police quickly caught word of the events that took place the night of Bridget's murder, and on March 21st, 9 people, including Michael Cleary, were arrested for involvement in the ill treatment of Bridget based on several people's accounts. The following day, her body was found in a shallow grave in a field a quarter mile from her home. She was severely burned and wrapped in a sheet, and her head had been covered in a sack. An infamous trial ensued that was well covered by the press and was even reported by the New York Times. Michael and the others charged insisted that they truly did believe Bridget was taken by fairies, but in the end, Michael Cleary's fairy defense failed and he was convicted to 20 years in prison. 7 others, 6 of whom were related to Bridget and included her father, were found guilty of wounding her and were given various short sentences, aside from her Aunt Mary, who was elderly and frail. According to the Irish Times, during the trial, while Justice O'Brien charged the jury, he said, quote, "This most extraordinary case demonstrated a degree of darkness in the mind, not just of one person, but of several. A moral darkness, even religious darkness, the disclosure of which had come with surprise on many persons," end quote. A fitting statement for this dark chapter in Ireland's history. Whether or not Michael Cleary truly believed his wife was a fairy or used the legend as an excuse to get rid of his defiant wife is still a mystery, but to a degree, justice was served and Bridget Cleary's remains were properly laid to rest beside her mother's grave. She lives on in legends, and even a famous Irish nursery rhyme was written about the events that prove that even the most evil creatures thought up by man still can't compare to the evil within man himself, which is the difference between a fairy tale and a sinister truth. Thank you so much for watching another episode of Macabre. I actually found a relative while researching the details of this event who was one of the examples of an unsavory character of Kyle Negrana at the time, which really proves how small this macabre world actually is. If you liked this video, please like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. And if you have an event, person, cryptid, or any other macabre or supernatural topic you'd like to see next, please let me know down in the comments. Thanks again, and I look forward to creeping you out again soon.